order, please. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this special forum on Greg Clark's book, A Farewell to Alms. I'm Alan Taylor, Director of the Center for the Evolution of the Global Economy. The man behind the camera is Eric Rauchway, Director of the Center for History, Society and Culture. We're co-sponsoring this event, and well, we're very happy to have you all here. We just wish we had more chairs. So I'd like to just very briefly introduce our speakers today. As you know, this is an event about Greg's book, which is, we're all delighted, by the way. It's been a labor of love and a scholarship for Greg over these many years, and you know, we've seen him working away on this for the last decade, or is it 2? And it's just been great to see the reception it's gotten, much of it positive, and so we've been able to bask in the warm glows, the reflected glows, and if we wanted to tan really fast, in some of the flames as well. As you may know, a lot of that activity has occurred on the blogosphere, so it's a particular pleasure to welcome 2 of the leaders of the econ blogosphere, the masters of the blogosphere, here today to comment on the book, since they have seen and filtered and reacted to many of these opinions and formed some of their own. And so it gives me great pleasure to welcome Brad DeLong from UC Berkeley, and also the author of one of the top economics blogs, Grasping Reality with Both Hands. And it's always a special pleasure to welcome Brad. He was one of my advisors in graduate school, and maybe familiar to you, he was here just a few weeks ago for a panel in this very room on blogging, as it happens. Our other guest here today is Tyler Cowen, and he is from George Mason University, and is also an author or co-author of one of the top economics blogs, Marginal Revolution. And he was here earlier today, so he may be even more familiar to you, to talk about his book, his new book that's just out, Discover Your Inner Economist. And finally, without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce Greg Clark, who will speak first. He's a professor here in the economics department at UC Davis, also chair of our department at the moment. And well, Greg can tell you more about this book, but I will tell you it's a huge and ambitious book. You just get that sense on page 1 of the preface when the author starts with comparisons to Adam Smith, Karl Marx, and Charles Darwin. So you get a sense that it's a very modest book. But you shouldn't be intimidated, because then you get to the next part of the book, which is chapter 1, and you find out that the author is going to present a brief history of the world, not in 10.5 chapters, but in 16 pages. And so I'm now going to ask Greg if he can do the same thing in 16 minutes.
Thank you. Let me say a little bit about the style of the book, which Alan raised, which is that the book is not afraid to be wrong. And I'm sure much of it may be, or some of it may be wrong. But it's an attempt to actually put down some arguments that people can then test, and that could lead us to a better picture of the history of the world. And it's in part grows out of a frustration with what seems to me a kind of an existing economics, an economic history, which is just mired in a Sargasso Sea, and which has basically gone nowhere since the time of Adam Smith, in terms of explaining the great questions of economic history, that we really haven't advanced. And it's something you get this constant recycling of the idea that it's just a question of incentives, that if only societies can get the incentives right, then we will have economic growth. That if societies are poor compared to rich now, again, it's simply going to be a matter of the failure to deliver the appropriate incentives, and that basically people everywhere are inherently motivated by the same desires. They inherently all want to be in a McMansion with 2 kids going to an Ivy League college, and it's just a problem of a number of economies that you don't get the appropriate incentives correct. And so in setting out for this book, the first task was actually to decide how many events there were in the history of the world. And that's a surprising but interesting question, because what actually happened to get us here? You know, how many actual important events were there? And the book makes an argument that there was essentially only one event in the entire economic history of the world, which is why it's possible to write about it in 420 pages, which was the Industrial Revolution. I've since come to believe, as part of the discussion about the book, that I was one event out. That world history actually had two events and not one, which may be a relatively large error. But it's a lot less than the number of events that most people think must have been important and must have mattered in terms of the economic history of the world. And so the crucial idea in the book is that essentially nothing changed about the human condition in terms of material living standards, in terms of life expectancy, in terms of numbers of surviving children, all the way from the very earliest people up until 1800, even in the most sophisticated societies like Britain. And that already is an incredible, startling empirical claim that will be interesting to test, but the book presents interesting evidence that if you take the average hunter-gatherer and the average resident of England around about 1800, and England is acknowledged to be one of the wealthiest societies in the world at that time, you can't find any difference in terms of calorie consumption, life expectancy, variety of diet. And in fact, hunter-gatherers had much less work to do than the English. And so that if you wanted to choose 100,000 BC or even England in 1800, it would be quite reasonable to go back to 100,000 BC. And it turns out that England in 1800 is considerably wealthier than probably 90% of mankind at that time. And so the evidence, if anything, is that living standards actually declined between the earliest humans and the world of 1800. And so one of the things then that raises is, well, why was it possible after 1800 to get economic growth if it's not due to any kind of incremental improvement in living conditions? And the second startling claim of the book is that that's because those previous 100,000 years changed people very significantly. That we're not the same as the original hunter-gatherers. That may be a cultural change, but it's also quite likely that we're genetically not the same as the original people of the African savannah. And the book documents that it's a simple implication of this Malthusian world, called Malthusian because Malthus in 1798 is the first one to really fully appreciate the dynamics of that world. It's a simple implication of that economic system that the average person can only have 2 surviving children, but some people will have more than 2 surviving children, and some people will have less. And one of the things that the book does empirically is to illustrate how in pre-industrial England, reproductive success was closely tied to economic success. And that the rich basically took over English society in the 600 years before the Industrial Revolution. They came to populate the society because of their extraordinarily reproductive success, and the poor disappeared. And that the modern day English are actually descended from the upper classes of this early world, but not an upper class that attained its position through violence and conquest, an upper class that attained its position through success in ordinary commerce and economic activity. And that at the same time, you can see significant changes in basic attributes of people. And one that the book can document all the way back to ancient Babylonia is that people have become much more patient than they were in the ancient world. The prevailing risk-free interest rate, which is a measure of the degree of patience of the society, in England around about 1750 is down to 4%. It's very close to modern levels. In the Middle Ages, it's 10%. In ancient Babylonia, it seems to be about 20%. That's what mortgage rates were in the ancient world. And that seems to reflect, it's not institutional change, that's what the book has documented. It really is a change in the nature of people. You can see this change also in terms of violence, the rate of violence. You can see it in terms of how much people work between hunter-gatherer and modern society. And so the book says, in some sense, a peculiar group of people at the end of this long sojourn in the Malthusian era inherited the earth. And in some ways, it's the envious that have inherited the earth. It's those who needed economic success, those who had to work, those who needed more, It's not necessarily people who are any better or who are any smarter than the original hunter-gatherers, but, and the interesting question just, is that a cultural product or is it a genetic product? And there's some interesting reasons to think why a lot of it, some of it at least, may be genetic. But what it's actually saying is that the arrival of kind of settled agrarian systems changed people, and that there was an interaction between the development of market economies and the development of human nature. And interestingly, you know, for example, given the kind of commands of religions like Christianity, one of the interesting things is you can actually show in England that it was the selfish that inherited the earth. Those who gave the least to charity had greater reproductive success over this period. And the argument of the book then is that that provided the crucial extra stimulus for the kind of move toward modern economic growth. That back in the time probably of the Romans, the Greeks, Babylonians, who probably had economic systems good enough for growth, but that was the crucial extra stimulus for modern growth that is really founded on a kind of a cultural achievement. The book then tries to document why that achievement was occurring more rapidly in somewhere like Western Europe than it was in China or Japan or New Guinea. And the final part, and then what we describe the Industrial Revolution, the final puzzle that we're left with, and this one I admit is one that's less satisfactorily grappled with in the book, is why all societies then didn't achieve economic development since the Industrial Revolution. But one thing the book really tries to stress again there is that whatever the reason is, it's absolutely not the institutional reasons that economists keep talking about. That to cure corruption in Africa, you won't get economic growth. I mean, the evidence is very strongly that it's actually something to do with the cultural structure of these societies. The book is arguing that some of that may be inherited from the long histories of these societies. There are other elements that clearly are quite malleable. But the big emphasis in the book is to say that before 1800, economics actually is relatively successful in predicting which are rich or poor societies, right? We can actually explain that fairly well. The interesting thing is that as economic salaries have moved ever upwards, the ability of economics to successfully predict economic success or failure is actually declining drastically. And there's a curious mismatch between the modern status of economics and its actual applicability in the modern world. In the pre-industrial world, we can actually use it quite successfully. We can explain why people are rich in 1450 but not 1300. In the modern world, it's actually become much more difficult. And as last question is, well, why are there then two events in world history and not just one? And here, the interesting thing that I've actually come to realize is that this kind of pre-industrial mechanism, this kind of movement of culture in response to economic stimuli, that was achieved because of the development of societies with stable property rights in the long pre-industrial era and transfer of property through non-violent means. There are actually settled agrarian societies, such as in New Guinea, which didn't achieve that property rights transition, and where each village is still, until recently, has been at war with others, that land distribution is decided constantly by armed conflict. And so that's why, in some sense, that's a second element in the history of the world is we had a hunter-gatherer society, we moved to settled agriculture. Why in some of those settled agrarian societies, you achieved a different kind of economic system where the distribution of gains was through economic activity. That seems to be a separate second event, which then eventually leads in these societies to the onset of modern economic growth. And so some of the book has, this is only describing a small share of the various issues that are explored in the book. There's a whole bunch of stuff about why did income distribution become much more equal, what's the future prospect for income distribution. There's lots of other subsidiary issues. But it's basically a book of saying, let's take some ideas, let's see what evidence we can find about how these ideas work, and if these are wrong, at least we could then move to saying, well, what more complicated model do you want? If you don't like this model of the world till 1800, what do you want to put in its place? There has to be some other structure that will explain the commonalities across these societies, and then also that structure has to also explain why we get this long delay for economic growth, and then economic growth will only increase faster. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg.
Brilliant. All right, well, thank you. I've now known Greg, I think, for 27 years, since I first heard about the graduate student who was in Steve Marglin's class and had been sick of hearing for a semester about how the bosses oppressed the workers, and was going to write a paper for the class on how the workers oppressed the bosses. And ever since then, I've known that Greg, whatever Greg produced an idea, it would be either great or insane. And the problem would be figuring out which idea fell on which line. And this book is overwhelmingly great. This is a wonderful book. This is a superb book. This is a book that I was signed the last time I taught the Introduction to Economic History to Berkeley graduate students. And I'm going to assign it again this spring, especially if the paperback comes out, because the hardback is rather expensive and the online versions have been taken down due to a perhaps excessive concern of the publisher with intellectual property rights. But I don't want to talk about what's great about the book. I want to talk about what's insane about it, what's wrong, and what I would quarrel with. And so to start, let me put up some phony and made-up numbers on the blackboard, or the whiteboard. Because what's an economics seminar without phony and made-up numbers justified by nothing other than the raw assertion of the speaker? So let's say 8000 BCE, let's say 1 CE, 1500, 1800, 1900, 2007. Let's say population, human population of the world in millions. I assert it's 5 in 8000 BC, 170. By assertion, I actually had a professor once who on the blackboard said, by abusive notation, we write such and such. The assertion is almost as bad. 750, then we have 1500 million in 1900, and what, 6.3 billion today. And say Y over P, real GDP per capita in dollars of 2007 purchasing power. And let me just assert, along with Greg, that we're at $500 per year of per capita purchasing power from the invention of agriculture on up to 1500 because of Malthus. Because there are significant improvements in technology, enormous improvements in technology, right? A world that can barely support 5 million East African plains apes who've managed to escape from their native continent in 8000 BC is supporting 500 million by 1500, and they have all these interesting technologies like cannon and sailing ships and printing and religion and thugs with spears who say you owe them a third of your crop always, and so forth. All these interesting social and physical technologies. But still, you're stuck at $500 a year, just enough so that your children's immune systems are so compromised by malnutrition that all except 2 of them die before they can reproduce. Because these are truly very slow growth rates. In 1800, what? Let's say we're up to 600. By relying on Angus Madison, I'd claim we're at 1200 to 1900, and at 7,000 today. Where really only this is a real number. The rest are phony and made up. Nevertheless, they are orders of magnitude, and you feed these to say, a standard production function, in which you have natural resources which don't really grow, nature stays the same, and reasonable capital, say a natural resource share of 0.2, a capital share of 0.3, a labor share of 0.5. The residual is your total factor productivity growth, which grows at 100% per year on average for the first 8,000 years of agriculture. Then it doubles. It doubles to 0.02% per year once you get the Roman Empire and the Chinese Empire up and running. Now that's a huge change. It doubles. Then in the early modern period, the period that people like Jan de Vries, my colleague at Berkeley, say is really key, important, and interesting for the economic history of the world, it more than quadruples. to 0.09% per year as the worldwide rate of total factor productivity growth. And then, boingo, 0.89% per year from 1800 to 1900, and 2.00% per year from 1900 to 2007. This is what leads Greg to say that there's one event in world history, right? This. I'd actually say that there are three. There's this. There's the fact that this number here, right, goes up. That population doesn't expand fast enough in order to eat up all of our increased productive potential after 1800. That we are looking forward to a world that it looks like in 2050 will hit peak population of 9 billion or so, and then maybe start to decline, if only because once you break the link between sex and reproduction, it looks like your average woman in your average industrial or post-industrial country wants about 1.8 children, rather than 3, 4, 5, 7, or 9. That's the second. And the third is this property rights stuff. This fact that what's yours you keep, which actually comes quite late. That is, in 1000 BC, we have the prophet Samuel telling King Saul that he's supposed to take his army and go and kill all the Amalekites and destroy all their stuff. Saul doesn't. Saul takes some of the stuff, which makes Samuel really mad at him, and says that God has withdrawn his protective hand from you. That's a stage below transferring goods and services, right, through force and violence. That's destroying goods and services through force and violence. You have, when's the next good one? You have, say, 1200 or 1300, when the way that the English knights, the way that the knight in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales gets the stuff which allows him to be such a charming host to the pilgrims, is by going to France on chevauché. Chevauché means you go to France and you burn everything. And what you can't burn, you take, and you take only what's exceptionally mobile and valuable. And if you're lucky, this will get the French knights so mad they'll come out of their castles, and then they'll charge up the hill against the English archers with the stakes in front of them, and the King of England will have an extra province. If not, and usually the French aren't that stupid, you go back to England and you go on your pilgrimage to Canterbury, where you pray to the Blessed Martyr and you entertain your fellow pilgrims with good stories. And even here, even in Greg's native Scotland, say 2 generations before Adam Smith, you don't transfer things through peaceful economic exchange. Instead, every time you meet someone on the road, you think, is this a clan member who I should aid? Is this a clan enemy who I should kill? Or is this a stranger who I should simply rob? The transformation to security property rights takes place remarkably late. And I, at least, am predisposed to think that Greg's decline in real interest rates from the 20% of Babylonia to the 10% of early modern Europe, the 10% of the Middle Ages, to, say, the 4% of the era of Jane Austen, when one reason that Fitzwilliam Darcy is worth marrying is that he has $20,000 a year, and you capitalize this at 25 times annual earnings, so he has a capital value of half £500,000, and down to our current value of 3% or so today. That security of property rights, along with a whole bunch of other institutional changes. To resort to Jane Austen again, the fact that her heroine, Elizabeth Bennet's father, is not allowed to sell off the property or even to cut down all the forests on it to provide dowries for his daughters. Hence, they have to live by their wits and find a rich husband quickly before their father dies and the property and its income go to the odious Mr. Collins. A powerful social custom on institutional invention tending to force the family to be more patient, even though no individual member of the family currently alive wants to, The person who wants to be patient is the person 2 or 3 generations back who assigned the ente. So this is the big picture. This is the big picture that Greg points out. And he wants to ascribe this big change here to patience. To the fact that all of a sudden in 1800 in England, or earlier in 1750 and 1730 in England, we have a society that is patient, and before here we don't. And I don't doubt that patience is important. I don't doubt that patience is wonderful. I don't doubt that there were a whole bunch of things tending to make England and English men and women a lot more patient in the 19th and 20th centuries than they had been before. But still, you have a fall in the real interest rate from 10% to 3%. That's supposed to drive a 100-fold acceleration in the pace of technological progress. It seems to me that if you want to argue that patience is important, you then also have to say, and we're facing some kind of knife-edge social mechanism here by which relatively small changes in patience, just 1 order of magnitude change in patience, produces a 3 order of magnitude change in the rate of economic progress. That perhaps the most interesting thing is the system is so vulnerable, so much on its knife edge, so incredibly responsive to what is a substantial, but I wouldn't be surprised if this generated a 3 or a 6-fold increase in the rate of total factor productivity growth, not a 100-fold increase. And then it tends to think, well, if the system's that knife edge, maybe other changes that Greg dismisses as too small to matter, maybe they could have made a huge difference as well. Maybe we should think about other things that make technological progress easier and more likely, like the fact that England is an island, and an island with a big navy. So perhaps a good deal of this fall in interest rates does come from security of property as enforced by the Royal Navy. Perhaps you want to point to modern science, but let me leave that to Tyler, because he can talk about modern science for 45 minutes without drawing breath and how wonderful it is. Perhaps there are other more obscure cultural orientations away from things that are likely to produce positive sum returns. At this point, I should probably quote Aristotle of Stagira and point out that he writes that a collection ought to be made of the scattered accounts of methods that have brought wealth to certain individuals. For example, consider the plan of Thales of Miletus, which is a device for the business of getting wealth, and is of universal application. Thales, because of his poverty, was taunted that philosophy was useless. However, from his knowledge of astronomy, he observed that while it was still winter, that there was going to be a large olive crop that year. So he raised a small sum of money and paid round deposits for all of the olive presses on Miletus and Chios, which he hired out at a low rent, as nobody was running him up. And when the season arrived, there was a sudden demand for a number of presses at the same time, and he let them out on whatever terms he liked, and realized a large sum of money, so proving that it is easy for philosophers to be rich if they choose, but this is not what they care about. And I want to say that Aristotle is admiring a fellow philosopher for playing a big negative sum game, right, for society as a whole. You expect him to say, so he hired workmen to build extra olive presses, or so he hired ships and went out and collected extra olive presses from the Asia Minor mainland and brought them in, and so increased the supply and earned the gratitude of his country by allowing them to press the bumper crop of olives. Or a number of things, other than he engaged in, say, just a slightly more sophisticated way of exploiting his fellow humans, not by saying, I'm a thug with a spear, give me a third of your crop or he'll kill you, but I have these rights to the olive presses unless you pay me what rent I demand. I won't let you press your olives and they'll rot and they'll be wasted. There are lots of potential explanations. Greg's patience is, I think, a very good one. But the thing I focus on is the disproportion of the response, right, to the stimulus, and say that that is the big question that Greg's book leaves me with. And because he raised it, I can't let the genetic stuff kind of pass without asking a question.
Leave that up.
Leave that up.
Oh,
Okay.
No, we're going to move forward.
Oh, all right. We'll write in green. You know.
Yeah.
Say, suppose there really are patient's genes. And patient's genes doesn't mean you develop a patient character or a patient brain. Say there's 2/3 a chance that if you have patient genes, you're patient, and 1/3 chance that you're impatient. Great. And then depending on whether you're patient, right, or you're impatient, it doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be rich or not. And say if you're patient, there's a 2/3 chance, that you'll be rich, and a 1/3 chance you'll be poor. And if you're impatient, a 1/3 chance you'll be rich, and a 2/3 chance you'll be poor. So that we got 5/9, of the rich people are ones who actually have patient genes. And then, reproductive success. The rich will indeed have more kids. Their kids will be taller. They won't be environmentally stressed. They'll have better immune systems. Although apparently not so in China. But still, if you apply the same 2/3, 1/3 back of the envelope made-up number rule of thumb, what you have is you have 14/27. That for every the rich person's odds of having children who then survive to adulthood will be on the order of 14/27. For poor, it's 13 out of 27. That means that the share of rich genes in the population increases by 1/27, by 0.04 per generation, by 0.16 a century. That means it takes 5 centuries if the patient gene frequency starts out low for it to double. If in 1200 you have 1% of the population with patient genes, by 1700 you're all the way up to 2%. If in 1200 you have 10%, by 1700 you're all the way up to 20%. Now there is genetic change in human populations. I look at us. I don't think there's a single active melanin gene in this room. And yet when our 1,000 ancestors left the Horn of Africa for Arabia in the Middle East 40,000 years ago, almost everyone had 3 or 4 of their melanin gene slots filled. And we don't have, in fact, 40,000 years was enough to make us all snow people. We're snow people because as you move north, the sun gets weaker and you need sunlight in your skin to make vitamin D in your skin. And if you don't have vitamin D, it doesn't get to your bones and your bones don't grow right, which is of absolutely crucial importance, not just because you get spindly legs, you get rickets. It's absolutely important because the female pelvis doesn't form right. Hence, you die in childbirth with high probability if you move too far north with a dark skin, without cod liver oil, or something equivalent to get you your vitamin D supplements. That, the geneticists think, takes a couple to 10,000 year periods to actually work out. Human genetic change takes a long time because our generation size is high. What's the advantage to being patient that applies so much, that puts such enormous selection pressure on British populations then and not on other populations earlier? And how can that cause such a huge change in how people behave in what really is a matter of some 20 generations? Those are, I think, very hard, irresolvable questions for Greg to answer, which is, I think, he's on much, much stronger, in fact, solid ground, when he wants to talk about culture and institutions and patience. than when he wants to go a step further and back. And let me turn it over to Tyler before Alan Taylor does something bad.
Tyler.
Thank you, Alan.
Unlike Greg or Brad, I think there are 17 fundamental events in human history. And I will explain why, but let me first summarize what I think Greg's contribution is, which I think is truly major. It's one of the most impressive economics or historical works of our time. I view the Industrial Revolution and the rise of modernity simply as the #1 problem in economics and in human history. So first, I applaud Greg for tackling it. And not enough economists take on the important problems. But not only has he tackled it, but he has added or improved 2 new explanations which I think carry a great deal of weight. And the first of these I call quality of labor. Like Brad, I think it's culture rather than genes, but that's a side issue. Quality of labor was one factor behind the takeoff in Britain. And the other related but distinct one is what Greg calls downward mobility, and that is the peopling of the lower classes with Englishmen who were once wealthy or saving a lot or who had better cultural habits. So when it comes to explaining why the world turned around and why we're sitting here in a fantastic structure and receiving higher education, it is the Industrial Revolution and these 2 factors of quality of labor and downward mobility, both identified by Greg, explained by Greg, to some extent tested by Greg. To me, this is simply a phenomenal contribution. And I'm very honored to have actually been the first person to write up Greg's book manuscript, or at least I think I was the first. So that's where I agree. Most of Greg's positive arguments, at least if we translate genes into culture, I'm pretty much on board with. Where I disagree is what Greg wants to rule out. And because we only gave him 50 minutes, he was more keen to tell you what he believes than what he doesn't believe. This makes perfect sense. But if one reads the whole book, I'm troubled by the alternative explanations which Greg wants to rule out. One thing he did mention in his remarks is that he thinks institutions come very close to not mattering. And this is the argument I have the hardest time swallowing. Let me start out with 2 extreme comparisons, and I'll move to 2 more gradual ones. The first is North and South Korea. The second are the former East and West Germanys. Now, I suspect Greg would, and indeed will in his rebuttal, admit that at the extreme cases, of course, institutions can matter. But I think even if you look at more intermediate cases, you see a huge role for institutions. Let's compare, say, Malaysia and Singapore. Neither is a totalitarian dictatorship. What one could do, a la Greg, is to look at the relative incomes of Chinese in Malaysia and Malays in Malaysia and see that the incomes of the Chinese are much higher, and therefore say institutions can only be one part of a broader explanation. Again, I'm fully on board. But if we compare the incomes of the Chinese in Malaysia to the pretty much genetically and culturally pretty identical Chinese in Singapore, we see the Chinese in Singapore are really much wealthier, and that simply cannot be a genetic or cultural explanation. It absolutely must be the difference in institutions between Singapore and Malaysia. And I just don't see how Greg gets out of this box. I view Greg's argument as having pinpointed 2 very important factors, but being excessively reductionist and wanting to eliminate the importance of other factors. And you could go around the map, you could go around the globe and look at the relative incomes of Chinese in many different countries. It could be Thailand, it could be Indonesia, it could be the United States, it could be Vancouver, Canada. And I think in pretty much every case you can conclude it is not simply institutions, but every case will also lead you to believe, yes, absolutely, institutions do play a central role. There are, of course, also Chinese in Mongolia and Chinese in a number of other places that are simply quite extremely poor. So that's really my major objection. When I say there are 17 factors or 17 events, one of which I would add is the one Greg mentioned, and that has to do with predation. I think one major reason that England rose out of what Greg calls the Malthusian trap is not just this cultural shift, but it's the fact that England was an island. England had a strong navy. Most of all, the fiscal organization of the English state was nothing short of genius. So if you were growing up in England in, say, the 18th century, the degree of protection that you had against external enemies and some fair degree of internal stability was really very strong. And this was an important part of the English miracle, that it's not just economic institutions. It's not just quality of labor. It's not just the composition of the population, but it was their ability to defend themselves. And also being surrounded by water gave England very good transportation. And most of all, I would say science, 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 that we could talk about this blue in the face, about how smart people are, or how well protected they are, or what a great market economy they have. But unless they are able to develop sophisticated science of the sort that was developed in late modern Europe, then none of this is going to take off. And I would favor an explanation that has about 17 variables. One of them is science, one of them is protection against predation. A series of them concern institutions. Two of them are Greg's quality of labor and downward mobility. But in my basic take, we have a model with 17 core factors, and Greg has nailed 2 of them, but there are still 15 other factors, and I just really don't get how it is he rules out so much scope for the 15 other factors, no matter how good his arguments are for the factors he wishes to focus on. It's important to realize here, if there's this one big event in human history, it means we really just have one data point. And when we have one data point, it means our explanations are not going to have predictive power, they're not going to be testable, they're not going to be falsifiable. So if my basic tale of what happened is, it was really complex, there were 17 different factors, they intertwine in ways we don't understand, there's a lot of ad hoc things I bring in. And if Greg says, well, this factor you cited, we had it in Song Dynasty China, and it didn't matter then, and then I want to bring in 7 other reasons why Song was different, and then we talk about the Aztecs, and I bring in 3 reasons why that was different, and I kind of hold to my 17-factor explanation and fight all these wars with Greg about the Song Dynasty and the Aztecs and wherever else we talk about the Romans. Greg really can't come back to me and tell me all of my defensive moves are ad hoc, because Greg has started by telling us there's really just one data point, and when there's one data point, all we really can do is ex post reconstruction. And when we do ex post reconstruction, what I see are these 17 factors. And another big one to me, it's culture, but it's a very specific kind of culture. It's an ideology of progress, it's an ideology of free inquiry, and it's an ideology of what we would very broadly call liberalism. And I know Greg talks about culture, and you might include all of these things under the rubric of culture. But in Greg's book, as well as I remember, he never points to culture and points to freedom of intellect, ideology of progress, maybe some version of Protestantism, classical liberalism, the whole particular sense of culture that infused England and America, and maybe wasn't in Song Dynasty China, that in my view is an essential part of the 17 factors, along with institutions and safety from predation and science and the 11 other things I haven't even figured out yet. And I know certainly that my list isn't complete. So in closing, let me just make one broader point about Greg's approach, maybe a way it differs from mine. When I read Greg and reread Greg, I keep on having the sense that it just feels to me, one way or another, he has spent too much time with David Ricardo and Ricardo's obsession with the long run. So when I hear Greg talk about the Malthusian model and argue that the hunter-gatherers are just as well off as an Englishman in 1685 or whenever, I'm not convinced that's true, but even if that's the case, there's something enormously important about the transitions. Even if the Malthusian model holds in some very long run, that there's an enormous amount of activity going on in the transitions, and the Dark Ages really were not nearly as good as the height of the Roman Empire, yet there are periods of centuries or hundreds of years with persisting standards of living, and that even if Malthusianism someday causes the world to adjust back to its basic starting point, my perspective somehow has this shorter time frame where I think most or almost all of the time we're outside of the long-run Malthusian equilibrium, even if that's some kind of powerful magnetic force. The short run is what matters, in the sense that we're just comparing like a single living healthy hunter-gatherer to a single living English person, say circa 1680. The way you get from a lower population to a higher population is fewer people die, or the way you get back to a Malthusian equilibrium is a large number of people have to die. And part of Malthusian equilibration is that pain and suffering and torture of having malnutrition and dying and getting sick. So I don't think of the long run with fewer people and equal wages as somehow as good as the situation with more people and the same level of wages. that what human history is really about is just the process of those equilibrations. And Greg has a habit of just comparing like one person alive in hunter-gatherer society to one person alive at different points in the future, but aggregate population is greatly different, and there are transitions stretching for centuries with urban cities and creative powers and Periclean Athens and the height of Rome, and that was different from the Dark Ages. And Greg's what I would consider a Ricardian tendency to a bit blur this together and just compare the starting point and the end point. I don't think it's essential to his contributions at all, but it's very different from how I would view it, and I would take that as another issue where I part company with Greg and his book. But anyway, I would highly recommend the book. I think it's splendid. I think it's one of the most important economics and history books of our time. And again, I think Greg's two core key explanations absolutely hold water, and he has great arguments for them. But I still want to keep the other 15 explanations on the table.
Thank you, Tyler. I'm going to throw it back to Greg briefly, because I think I gave you 16 minutes to give us the whole story, and I think you only used 11, so your remaining 5 is right here.
Yes, I wanted to save some ammunition. So first for Brad, I mean, Brad is of course a brilliant defender of an untenable position.
Here we go.
And so, I mean, once you start throwing in all these other events, the problem then is, what's your theory about why they come in that order? What's your theory about the kind of 100,000 years when these events might have occurred but didn't occur, right? You're into the miasma, you're into the swamp, and add the 15 other explanations here, and then the problem you get into is you're just going to get another history, which is a mix and match from various of these cultural and various other elements, where you run into these fundamental problems of, why did one thing occur after or before the other? Why didn't it occur much longer before? And one of the things that Tyler raised was, look, you've only got one data point. You've got one industrial revolution. But actually, we have a huge bunch of other data points. We have all these societies which didn't have an industrial revolution. And what's interesting there is that if you really think it's this institutional mix, what you see is an incredible choice and mix and match of institutions in earlier societies. People try everything, right? There are religious impulses, there are all other kinds of things coming along. And the puzzle is, if you really think it's institutions, not just setting the rules of the game, why didn't some society produce the right mix in the time before the Industrial Revolution? That's what institutionalists really have to come down to. Why wasn't there some mix? Because as far as we can tell, there's no society which gets above a 0.1% rate of productivity growth over 100 years in the period leading up to the Industrial Revolution. And that's the great puzzle for institutional history is, institutions are such an easy thing to spark an industrial revolution. The second great problem you run into is, why aren't there so few books about the Industrial Revolution now? It's because given the dominant insistence on institutions, people who know about English history know that change was very slow, was very incremental, all the way from the Middle Ages up to 1800, and that it's just a desert for institutionalists. I mean, some of the finest work that's done by people in this area tends to find that English institutional change made very little difference. Once it's done correctly, you see that each change has very little magnitude. And so I think that's one of the reasons that, it's the 12 years of exploration, of wandering through the desert here, which makes you realize that these institutional explanations are really not going to work very well. And then again, to turn to Tyler's point, I absolutely acknowledge, we know that North Korea, South Korea institutions make a huge difference. But it's this long-run perspective. When you're writing long-run history, what you realize is, we don't expect that North Korea is going to be around in 50 years, right? We don't expect that Cuba will still be run by kind of Castro-type socialism. What you see there is incredible forces that tend to sweep away dysfunctional institutions in these societies. It may take hundreds of years, but there is this corrective mechanism, and there is a tendency towards efficiency. And the book actually gives lots of examples of how even the most extreme religious ideology will quickly get undermined by market forces. You can have Islam and say farewell to usury. Within a few generations, you get the development of contracts which are completely usurious and also completely committed under the religion. And so I just think people, so there's a lot of the book about this, the overwhelming power of institutions. Now, Brad emphasized this point, patience. Patience is just used here as an illustration. The book is not arguing in any way that it's specifically the development of patience had anything to do with the Industrial Revolution. It's saying you can use this as a diagnosis of the fact that the culture of these societies have actually changed in very dramatic ways, right? And we're thinking of a broader kind of cultural change. But the interesting thing is that we can find, certainly in the case of medieval England, a society which offered people a 10% return in a way that is much more strongly guaranteed than in the modern housing market. Much more strongly guaranteed, where land values are completely stable over 120 years, and yet people needed that return, and anyone could engage in that investment. Land was sold in units, very small transaction costs, traded in the village core. There are tons of villages in England where over 500 years absolutely nothing happened, right? I mean, these are the dullest people in the world. And yet, you have this demand for these extraordinarily high rates of return. And that's what the book is trying to grapple with, which is how do you have change in a world where a lot of the things that we focus on are not changing systematically in a better direction, or are changing very, very slowly. And I absolutely understand Brad's issue here about the suddenness of the Industrial Revolution, which is a threat to any kind of evolutionary explanation. But what the book tries to emphasize is that this change that he's put here is wildly overestimated in terms of how quickly that change actually occurred. That wouldn't even be true of England in this period in the rate of productivity growth. And the book also emphasizes that there was a lot of change occurring earlier here. Change in the stuff that Tyler would love, right? Opera, food, all of these other things. But it's the conventional way that we measure income tends to overweight certain types of change. From the upper class perspective, all the way from the Middle Ages, there's an accelerating process of change going on in this society. And it's just that our metric of translating that into total factor of productivity increase depends on very accidental and very contingent features.
Well, on weighting the peasant majority as if it were the majority.
Right,
yes.
right. And so from our perspective, from the perspective of Brad and I, the 15th century probably we'd say that's when the action happened, right? And so the book actually is aware, and I agree. I mean, this is one of the puzzles that we have to face, right? Is why, and it's a puzzle that institutional change would help us with if we could observe any institutional change in this period. And then lastly, on Tyler wanting to hold on to 15 other, explanations, think about if you wanted to describe the physics of the development of the universe, right? What would you say about scientists, right? If they really wanted a theory of the who said there's 15 factors we have in reserve which will come into play sometimes and not others in terms of how this model will work, you would say you can't have a history that way, right? I mean, so that this is really saying if you want a history, if you want a causation, you can't do it with 17 independent different factors. There has to be an underlying simpler structure to the history of the world. And the amazing thing is actually, in terms of writing books, how much historians have given up on that idea that there might be a direction to history, that it's not just a series of episodes and different stages, that there really is some underlying dynamic. But I think that thinking about this, there has to be, to get a causal explanation of history, there has to be a narrower set of factors if you're going to get it.
Thank you, Greg.
How many people in this room paid off their credit card balance in full last month? You're exceptional. Half the population of California did not, is carrying a credit card balance from one month to another, and so are paying those 20% interest rates of Babylonia. They're certainly not patient in Greg Clark's sense.
Yeah, but the crucial point is that we have a class of people in modern society who never paid credit card debt, and it's quite a significant class, and where they influence the underlying rate of return on risk-free assets in a way that didn't happen in this society. Everyone in this society would pay credit card debt in the Middle Ages.
The Bank of America would really clean up if only we could go back to Babylonia.
Well, my thanks to the panel, and I'd like to throw the mic open and invite questions from the floor, and of course, debate will rage at the front as well, but we'll just take it as it goes. So, if you have a question, raise your hand.
I have two, but the first one is merely my own confusion. I read the book, and I didn't understand a certain move, and it actually goes to the issue of downward mobility. I trust there's a simple explanation, and I'm naive, but I look forward to it. In the account of downward mobility you give at the beginning, it goes in short that the rich have more surviving children than the poor. Slots open up in the matrix of necessary jobs, and they have to be filled by downward mobility. The two things I don't understand about that are, one, is it empirically the case that the matrix of jobs stays absolutely fixed rather than in fact shifting and contracting when there is demographic shift? And two, you seem to pose that there's identical pressure of competition on all parties, the rich and the poor, so that the rich will win the competition because there's more of them, they're sort of surviving better. But of course, it seems to me there's less pressure on them to seek those jobs since they are in fact rich. So that there's not in fact equal impetus to fill those spots if they are indeed stable, which I'm curious about as well. So that's basically two explanatory questions, if you could help me with this.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I'm mainly an empirical historian, and this was one of the kind of surprising and kind of powerful dynamics that I didn't expect going into the book. I thought that the survivors in pre-industrial England would be all of those who enjoyed the idiocy of the countryside, and that we would be the remnants of the rural peasantry who didn't go to cities, who didn't expose themselves to any risk. And where you get this nice story about, that the hunter-gatherers were the people with energy and kind of initiative, and we were the beneficiaries of good gut bacteria. But you do see this pattern, a very powerful pattern of economically successful people producing these surplus children. And we know over time in the society that there was actually probably some change in the distribution of jobs. But it's got to be very limited relative to the numbers of those surplus children. And so they've got to do something, and everyone in the society has some kind of occupation. There's actually, in the group I'm looking at, there's not that many that just live on land. And so they've got to find some occupation, and the only occupations that are going to be available for a lot of these surplus children are the more downwardly mobile. And what's interesting about this society is that by the 17th century, your formal occupational title is not that good a guide to your real economic status. Like laborers actually end up owning assets, owning houses, and you really get the sense of a lot of kind of mobility. And it's an interesting society in that sense, that it's really fluid, but you do see this tendency that we know must be there, right? Because we can observe the overall reproductive success. We can see these rich people, they're producing these surplus children. And so that's why there had to be that effect, and we can see it back all the way to the Middle Ages. We think it probably occurred before that. We think it occurred, and the argument of the book here is this is a general tendency that's going to exist in any stable property rights society where you can transfer assets between children and parents. It may operate much more powerfully in some societies than others, though, right? But that's why, and it would be nice to get other evidence about whether this really does take place. This is done by inference. But I'm pretty confident that there's no other way out in England in this period. There has to be this downward mobility that's very powerful within society.
Yes, Professor Clark, I'm wondering how you define or employ the concept of culture in your book. And I'm thinking specifically how your book might confront the arguments of Jared Diamond and Guns, Germs, and Steel. And in his book, society's economic condition is the product of culture, but culture is, in turn, thoroughly the product of material endowments and geographical happenstance. I mean, how do you use that? I mean, define culture.
Well, the book is also saying, it is saying, look, why did we move to certain cultural forms? So in England in 1800, people worked amazing amounts. Right? We still work an amazing amount in the modern world, given our incredible affluence. All of our benefits in somewhere like England, since the Industrial Revolution, the 10-fold, 15-fold increase in incomes has all been used to consume more material goods. And none of it has been used to purchase leisure. We've developed a society which is very unusual compared to hunter-gatherer society, very high labor inputs, very high attachment to material goods, and with a culture that kind of goes along with that. There's an interesting kind of Christian religious ideology that doesn't fit our basic behavior within this culture, but is interestingly maintained by people very strongly, but somehow has adapted to the underlying realities of economic life, which is that you hold on to what you've got and you give it to those who are genetically related to you whenever possible. And so what the book is trying to say is that culture is produced in these earlier societies by endowments and by the economic system, and we can see how it's being produced within these societies, that the meek are not with us anymore. The kind, the gentle, they've all gone. We're the bastards of the pre-industrial world who have come to take over this world, and that in that sense, what it's trying to say is that culture, when it's invoked, typically in economic arguments, is thrown in as this external thing, right? Which is going to be explained very loosely by intellectual developments or other developments. What the book is trying to say is that you can actually see why a certain type of culture would tend to dominate in those societies, and why hunter-gatherer society might have a very different culture. And that's just an idea. It's an interesting idea, though, because I think it's an idea that people haven't explored as much, about how even in settled pre-industrial societies, culture itself might be a product of the economic system, right? And that's all that the book is trying to say, is that there's that interesting linkage between culture and economics. So it's the final imperialism of economics, which is to say, we want to explain everything, right? We're not going to leave anything for sociology or history or anything else. It's all going to be reduced to the material life of these societies.
Isn't that exactly what Marx thinks? That culture is
Oh, absolutely,
unfolded
absolutely.
directly from the
Yes,
material conditions of
yeah,
art?
yes.
So you're a Marxist.
Marx believed in gravity. I also believe in gravity. That doesn't make
Is it true that we're more selfish than our predecessors? Right? Tyler likes Periclean Athens and the sculptures of Phidias and Praxiteles and so forth, but he averts his eyes from the state slaves of Athens who are digging out the silver at the southern end of the Attic Peninsula and are confined in 3-foot wide spaces at night in chains underground so they can work again, digging out more silver the following day to pay for the fleet that will, for the sculptors that will then raise the Parthenon.
I was only making the claim in terms of the English of 1800 compared to the English of 1200. Right? You actually could see in medieval England that people gave much more money to the church than to that, but I think they were thinking of that as a down payment on future vacation rental.
Yes. There is this sense in which gifts to charity is more investing in a superior performing asset class than religious.
Question from the back.
I came in late, and I don't know whether this is already disposed of or not, but there's been a kind of a school of thought, starting off maybe with Pomerantz and going through Robert Marx. It says it explains the Industrial Revolution as a product of colonies and coal. That is to say, resources and the ability of the English state to acquire markets and dominate slave labor and move goods around the world in such a way that there was a huge market and a lot to be gained from mechanization and industrialization that was a sort of a unique event in history. So I'm wondering what your comment would be on that.
So that is explored in the book. There's a kind of an alternative account of the rise of Europe. And in the details of the book, one of the things that's stressed is, the Industrial Revolution was really a product of the textile industry in this period, which it did not depend on coal in any direct way. And in Japan and China both had, and India, all had textile industries in these periods. They all had the prerequisites for that kind of technological advance for many centuries, even before the English. And then the second thing is that the strength of that development in England was strongly influenced by the existence of the Americas. And another paper that I'm working on with Alan and Kevin O'Rourke, we're actually exploring how much role that played in terms of how dramatic an impact that had on Europe as a whole. But the book emphasizes that that's a different question from that general movement upwards of the rate of inventiveness in this world, and that really is not going to be explained by either coal or by colonies. And one of the things that actually this exploration is going to say is that it was also the inventiveness of the Americans that was very important in actually spurring the Industrial Revolution as well. It wasn't just the existence of that land, it was the very significant advances that were made in the productivity of agriculture in the New World and slave agriculture. And my colleague Alan Olmsted has done some very interesting work on that, which is also going to be an important part of this story. But the story really emphasizes it was the increased inventiveness, the increased response of Europeans to these possibilities that was much more important than the contingencies of you. Well, you happen to have a coal supply near at hand, or you happen to have this real estate in the Americas.
Well, as a natural scientist, I'm inclined to think about currencies other than the kinds of currencies that economists think about. And my question was anticipated here. And so I'd go to the correlation between the shift from beasts of burden and mechanization and the use of fossil fuels is extraordinary here. And many natural scientists have written about that as a tremendous contributor, perhaps not one, not two, not up to 17, but at least one of the big ones, that we, through our inventiveness, were able to utilize fossil fuels to do the things that animals have done before. So thinking about the future, I read your book, very, very impressed, and it was a reading event of the fall for me. But you don't mention, I looked up, I don't know any economics, I looked up the word externality. and I teach the ecological history of human population, and I'm very concerned about, as are other natural scientists, about what's going to happen as this fossil fuel comes back to bite us in the rear. And so, can you reflect on that? How that's going to weigh into the way economists think about?
I agree. I mean, in the end, to try and get the book down to a length where it really could still be a brief economic history of the world, it's amazing the stuff that you have to just get left out, that you just won't find in the index, right? So we kind of find what I think the core of the story is here, and that whole transition between worlds where everything is reproducible, right? Self-sustaining world to our non-sustaining world now is relegated to a very subsidiary role. And essentially the book says, as a result of this transformation, we've largely liberated ourselves from the constraint of land in the modern world. And that, though, depends in part on the use of fossil energy, right? And that if that land constraint reappeared, it would certainly change the economic horizon. So the book in some sense says, well, the problem of growth was solved with the Industrial Revolution. We've had continual growth since then, and we're not, at present, we're really very loosely constrained, even at the current prices of oil. Resources are really not an important factor in the modern world, but there are various circumstances under which they could become very important again, and then we would have to think again then about the mechanisms of population density, about all of these other things as being important determinants of income. But at least in terms of the story so far, it turns out that they don't seem to be the thing that sparks the Industrial Revolution, and also that they become a relatively unimportant part of the story, though in any 1,200-page history of the world, it would certainly be an issue that you would want to include.
So it seems like your argument could be ironclad. So if population is fixed and the rich have more children, then it seems like the last thing to prove is that patience is heritable. And you can actually, Professor DeLong's earlier discussion shows maybe that you can calculate the minimal bound of the patience required so that a certain patience dominates population. Is that right? I mean, it sounds like it's testable then.
The idea of the book is that so for example, with this one thing, which I really don't want to emphasize patience, because it's only a marker.
I'm the one who said patience. I'm the one who first remarked it and parodied it by saying
it's only a marker, but here's the idea of the book. If you go to hunter-gatherer society, you live day by day. Everything you eat, you find that day. You move every day. There's a tiny set of things you can carry with you. You can imagine a world then where there's a lot of characteristics of people that are not selected for or against, right? Where there's a wide range of attributes here. Then comes a new world in terms of the economic mechanism. And in that kind of circumstance, where it's not 1% of the population that has this potential for patients, it could be quite a large fraction, then you could get very rapid movement if you have strong forces of selection. And we find even with things like lactose intolerance, that we would think that that would be a relatively weakly selected thing selected for in Europe, where you actually use milk products. What would be the advantage of being able to digest milk products? It could still not be more than 10 or 20% of people's diets, but you see that that diffuses within historical time all across Europe. It's not found in Asia. And so that absolutely the idea would be that there could be certain characteristics of people which you've got a range in the population before the arrival of settled agriculture. Suddenly it's a different set of things that's being rewarded in the economic system, and that you could have relatively rapid movement in this way. And one thing is, all books are to some extent autobiographical, and one of the things that impresses me is I have 3 children. They grew up in an absolutely equivalent environment. They differ dramatically in terms of their rate of time preference. And it turns out that there were these wonderful experiments done at Stanford where they took 4-year-olds and offered them a marshmallow now or 2 marshmallows in an hour, and that some kids would accept the marshmallow later, some would have to have it now, and that was a predictor of their future SAT scores and consequently of their college success and future earnings. And these are kids who we think they're growing up in a very similar cultural milieu, but where we know that there are factors of people's personality that are very important in terms of their economic success. And one of the issues that comes up in this book is that someone asks is, could this be genetic? What I would say to Brad is, do you believe that the rich in the modern world, the economically successful, are genetically equivalent to the poor? That all modern economic success is a product merely of circumstances of childbearing and accident? Or do you believe there's a genetic difference now between the rich and the poor? And if you think about that, I think you'd have to say there must be a genetic difference between rich and poor, and that consequently there must be in this pre-industrial world at least some genetic drift. So Brad?
I would say no. I would say that the person who ought to have my job as a tenured economic history professor at University of California, the person best equipped by their genetic endowment to fulfill this job and to be an economic history professor, is probably behind the plow in Bangladesh right now.
I'm talking within modern America, right?
No, it's probably just come across parents came across the Mexican border 40 years ago.
So Brad, I just think that you're genetically smarter than a lot of the population. That it's not just a product of the stories your parents read to you as a child. And I just don't think you can possibly believe that it's all a product of that.
Simon wants to interject on that.
But there's a tendency you have in the book that you say there's a genetic difference between hunter-gatherer society and modern Europe. And that I possibly can believe.
Lactose tolerance, for one thing.
Sure, but even with regard to intelligence and patience. But you then are trying to explain why England and not the Netherlands and not Italy had the Industrial Revolution. So the genetic differences across the hunter-gatherers won't explain that. You've then got to invoke something else.
Right.
But when you're pushed on the genetic issue, I'm uncomfortable with going back to the comparison with hunter-gatherers. And the other thing that I think you take as the wrong default is say something like, it must be downward mobility, because what other factor was not there in Song China or other settings, is an argument I've heard you make, and I read you as saying in the book. But it's also the case, we have no differential evidence on downward mobility in Song China. If it were the case that we knew there was downward mobility in English history, but not in Chinese history, then there might be some presumption that if we see no other differences between England and China, we'll say we had the Industrial Revolution in England because of downward mobility. But the facts you give on downward mobility are not comparing England and China, or England and Italy, or England and the Netherlands. There may be some comparisons between England and very brutal, primitive societies where people are murdered. So I think you're building in some presumptions in favor of your argument by switching back and forth between comparisons across different, more advanced settings and the comparisons with the hunter-gatherers.
The book actually does show that the samurai in Japan, which were this ruling class in a very peaceful society in Tokugawa, Japan, what was interesting about them was that they did not generate surplus sons who had to display this downward mobility, that they were essentially a closed class. There had to be a high degree of adoption by samurai families in order to perpetuate the family name because of their actually relatively quite low, it's still higher than the general population, but relatively quite low fertility. And so the book says there actually are interesting indications that this force of downward mobility in the pre-industrial world may have had different strength under different conditions of child rearing and childbirth. And so that, but that's just a possibility, right? But the thing that the book I think more strongly wants to emphasize is it's hard to explain why England, and in some sense, England is a little bit ahead of some other European societies, but the book downplays that. It's saying there is an interesting question though, why anywhere around about 1800? And that, I think, is on stronger ground of saying that there really were, and one of the things, there really were changes, and one of the things the book is trying to say is, look, we can see that Roman society is actually very different from English society in 1800. The Romans were much more brutal, much more illiterate, much more innumerate, their upper classes. They are a very different society, and that there has been very significant change there. And then just the last thing on this, I don't want to emphasize this whole thing about genetics. The only thing that I react to is people's horror about what is a very realistic possibility, right? And I think, why can't we be in a world where people can say there's possibility A, there's possibility B, most likely it may be mostly culture, there might be a little bit of genetic drift here. But there's part of me that says, well, Brad, why are you recoiling in horror from something that I know in your heart of hearts that you must believe? I know in your heart of hearts that you're not looking out at the people who are homeless in the street in Berkeley and saying, there but for the grace of God, go on.
There but for the grace of God, go on.
We have a number of people in line.
25-year generations, with 25-year generations, human genetic change has to be very, very slow. Much slower than a sudden tenfold acceleration in the rate of global technological progress across a matter of 4 or 5 generations. The Englishmen of 1850 are very similar to the Englishmen of 1750, are very similar from the population.
Let me just run back. Okay. There's nothing natural about these numbers, right?
I made them up.
Into a cardinal scale. Yeah. No, I mean, because there could be a big difference between a society where people just look at techniques and just generally are uninterested in trying to improve them, and one where you get to a point where there's a significant number of people, whatever technique they look at, they become interested in improving that, and that could actually produce, I mean, going from 0.02 to 1.0 is not necessarily a 50-fold change in the nature of activity in that society. Right?
Yes,
that's all I'm saying.
Yes, it is. The people and the monks were incredibly interested in better technologies of erasing ancient manuscripts and copying psalms on them. The Romans were incredibly interested in military technologies of brutality and violence. Pericles' team was incredibly interested in technologies for making better and more realistic sculptures. Then I want to maintain that these differences in global total factor productivity growth really are as close to a cardinal scale as we have. That all the inventions and all the inventive activity of all the humans in the world, or at least Eurasia, turned to trying to figure out how to do things better, produced 1% per century improvement in productivity back when people were writing on clay tablets with styluses, and produces the 7-fold increase in productivity in the past century. Right? And that difference between 7-fold and 1% a century, that I think, and you can't simply dismiss it on the grounds that this isn't really a cardinal scale.
We'll come back. Okay, I have 4 more questions in line. Rob, Lady on the Wall, and Joshua, and Peter, but we'll try and get through them as best we can. So, Rob.
So a minute ago you mentioned the textile industry, textile machines, and many of us are familiar with your work that these machines were similar, worldwide around the time of Industrial Revolution. But the number of workers assigned to do a task was quite different in different countries or even close villages. So we're enormously impressed. So my specific question is, how does that body of work play a role in your current argument here? And then the more general question would be, what does your history of the world tell us about cross-country
Right.
comparison.
Well, one way to kind of think about this, I have a friend who's a physicist, and he said, doing physics is often like having a truckload of giraffes that you're trying to drive under a bridge, and you're trying to get them all to duck their heads at the same time. And one of the giraffes here, which is bumping its head a bit, is this problem that a completely satisfying account of the history would somehow clearly would incorporate this incredible and increasing divergence between rich and poor across societies in the modern world. The book is saying, well, some of that may lie in the long history of the societies, but it's also clear that there are cultural differences of even shorter duration that matter within these economies. And one of the things that the book then says is, why would those kind of differences be more dramatic? Why would culture matter more in the modern world than earlier? And one of the things I appeal to there is the work of Michael Kramer, is a marvelous article where he points out that modern production techniques may give much more difference in terms of the wage that a worker would be paid to small differences in productivity between workers than in the pre-industrial world. And I give the specific example that in pre-industrial, in 1800, English observers of the Polish grain agriculture fell over themselves describing how terrible it was. The workers were slovenly when they could get alcohol, drunken. They would float the grain in barges down to the Baltic. They would not even cover the grain, so it would actually sprout on the barges and would be growing by the time it got to the Baltic. They'd just rip off that top cover. But then you could take that product, you could sieve it, and you could sell it, and it was fully as good as grain grown in the British market. And so the argument here was, in this world, you could have big differences in people's attentiveness, people's care, but it might have relatively modest differences in terms of the value of workers. But Kramer says, well, take a modern production technique, say for producing automobiles, get workers who are even slightly inattentive, and you could produce automobiles that are worthless by the time you get to the end of the factory. And if a whole bunch of workers have to cooperate, then the value in production of even relatively modest differences in people's attentiveness could be very low. And so the book argues, look, we may have actually, through the Industrial Revolution, moved towards production systems where those attributes of care, diligence, attention, willingness to work even without incentives in many cases, have become relatively more important, and where you can get societies like sub-Saharan Africa where wages are almost zero. I mean, wages are 1/50th of what they are in modern Germany, where that labor has very, very little value in production. And so that's the kind of line that the book argues. But again, it's a speculation, it's not something that's nailed down.
I was thinking about what you said about how people in the modern America at least are more prone to put their money into material reinvestment rather than leisure and goods. I've heard a lot of explanation that that may have been a result of the Protestant Reformation. I was wondering how that worked in your model.
Well, see, the book is endogenizing the Protestant Reformation, right? It's saying that the Protestant Reformation is exactly the kind of religious movement that you would expect given the underlying economy of this world. And that's what the book will be saying, is that you will probably get a certain religious ideology which will persist in societies that are under these kind of economic mechanisms for a very long time, right? And so it really is Marxian in that sense, that it's saying that culture is a product of the production, what's it called, the mode of production of the society.
So that when the selfish proportion of the population exceeds critical mass, boom, you have your 95 theses.
Yeah.
And then you have it's all about getting personally right with God, as opposed to a religion about how we all as a group have to go to church and obey the priest.
Right.
So that actually leads directly to my question, although first a remark, which is to say, I utterly believe that the four of you at the end of the table are genetically deserving of being there. But it's important we not confuse cause and effect, which is to say it may well be that the rich are genetically different from the poor, but that doesn't at all assign whether that's a result or a cause of their wealth, right? So let's just bear that in
I'm
mind.
from a poor background.
My question is this: in a way, it gets back to to your analogy to science and wanting sort of the simple William of Ockham explanation, the cleanest, purest explanation for all motion. But that requires an initial moment where the system is set in motion and gives it a directionality. So then the weak force and the strong force, the electromagnetic and gravity can do their thing, right? Or string theory or that. I don't see in your account that you just gave of, let's say, the Protestant Reformation or so on and so forth. So that's a culture that comes out of societies need to produce an ideological set of beliefs that lead it onward toward that path. How did it get on that path? What's that initial moment that says that market forces are going to be the description of what drives that entire sequence?
Well, one of the interesting things in writing this book was the opportunity to read a lot of anthropology, right? And it's fascinating. I mean, the accounts of hunter-gatherer and shifting cultivation societies, and they actually have a surprising commonality where there's a lot of sharing of output. Surprising sharing rules that people typically try and evade wherever possible. They lie and they cheat, but they are under the forces of these rules. And the argument of anthropology is that somehow that environment produces a certain type of cultural and economic system. And the crucial technological change then is the shift to settled agriculture, which produces storable output. It produces land that has a very significant value and that can be traded. It produces the possibility of giving your children permanent advantages through the endowment that you pass on to them. And so that the argument book then is that, and that's where I say that, you know, whether one event and world issue or two events, that arrival of that new system, it turns out that that didn't in itself inherently seem to imply the movement to private property and individual rights and eschewing violence as a way of settling the distribution of conflicts in society. That seems to be the crucial element, and I agree that since that is not pinned down, then you do have this interesting puzzle as to why we moved in a certain direction. Because as I say, if you go to New Guinea, but their geography may play a role, because New Guinea is characterized by lots of little valleys isolated from each other, where individual villages can remain independent, at war with each other all the time, whereas in other areas, there tends to be a dominance of one type of
You really are turning into Tyler, where sometimes it's, well, their geography may come up, well, their culture may play, well, there, it turns out there may be 17 things in your theory, but they come up now and then.
I just said that settled agriculture goes the other way, right? That Sargon of Akkad was the first person to feed 500 well-armed warriors at his table. That the rewards in Akkad, once you have Mesopotamia agriculture, to being one of the most 500 most vicious and skilled guys with a spear, are far in excess of the rewards in a hunter-gatherer society, where there's not as many peasants with stuff who you can steal stuff from.
Well, but I would assert that the tendency in all of these societies is actually for the rulers in these early societies to take less of people's output than in modern market America.
They physically can't.
I mean, that these are tended to be societies where the extraction by the government actually I mean, that's one of the puzzles of you addicted institutionalists, is that you moved from societies where you had relative liberty from the exactions of government.
Except when the government comes to your doorstep.
Well, still that have
And people would flee when they heard that Queen Elizabeth was coming, right? They'd leave the vicinity, so they'd shut up their houses.
And there was a French Revolution.
Yes.
All right, let me try and bring things to a close. We're running out of time. I think Peter wanted one last question.
I'm delighted both with the book and with the discussion. Very much wanted to pick up on some points that both Tyler and Brad had said, but we're smart enough to see across the room that it's past 6 o'clock. I'll pursue these points with Greg and the others in private. Thank you.
Okay, well, please join me in thanking our panelists. And thank you all for coming.
Good job.